They laughed at him through the bars, called him camera boy, told him he'd learn respect before morning. But what the white deputies in Red Hollow County Jail didn't know was that by sunrise the man in the holding cell would legally outrank every badge in the building. The booking area smelled like stale coffee, disinfectant, and the kind of arrogance that settles into old brick walls after decades of unchecked power, and Marcus Reed sat quietly on the cold steel bench with his wrists cuffed in front of him, orange jumpsuit hanging loose on his tall frame, glasses confiscated so the room blurred into indistinct shapes and moving shadows. Without them, the deputies probably thought he looked smaller, less precise, less dangerous, but Marcus had learned long ago that clarity didn't come from eyesight, it came from patience. Deputy Kyle Harmon leaned back in his chair at the intake desk, boots propped up, scrolling through his phone while grinning at something on the screen, and across from him stood Deputy Rick Colson, older, thicker around the middle, with a permanent smirk carved into his face like he'd spent 20 years perfecting the art of belittling people who couldn't fight back. "You should have heard him," Kyle said loudly, not bothering to lower his voice even though Marcus was 10 feet away, standing on the sidewalk like he's CNN or something. "Deputy, are you articulating probable cause?" Kyle mimicked in a nasal tone before bursting into laughter. Rick chuckled, shaking his head. "These Facebook lawyers are the worst. Couple YouTube videos, and suddenly they think they're Clarence Thomas." More laughter. Marcus didn't look up. Earlier that evening, he had been walking home from a community meeting when he noticed the deputies searching a teenage boy's car without consent, doors wide open, belongings scattered on the hood. He had calmly stepped onto the sidewalk, raised his phone, and began recording. "Am I being detained?" the teenager had asked nervously. "Shut up," Rick had snapped. Marcus kept filming. "Deputy, you are required to state your probable cause for search," Marcus had said evenly. Rick had turned slowly, eyes narrowing. "You interfering?" "No, sir. I'm documenting." That single word, documenting, had sealed his fate. Rick had walked over, invaded Marcus's space, and without warning twisted his arm behind his back. "Congratulations," Rick had said coldly. "You just obstructed an active investigation. Now, back in the jail." Kyle stood and walked toward the bars, squinting at Marcus. "So what was the plan, huh? Even upload that video? Get us fired." Marcus lifted his head slowly. Even without his glasses, his gaze was steady. "Public records laws exist for a reason," he said calmly. Rick rolled his eyes. "Listen to him. He talks like he's writing a dissertation." Kyle smirked. "What are you, some kind of activist?" Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Something like that." Rick stepped closer, lowering his voice but keeping the edge sharp. "You people always think you're smarter than you are." The words hung in the air, thick and deliberate. Marcus didn't react outwardly, but he filed the phrase away, storing it like evidence in a case he knew wasn't finished. "Deputy," Marcus said quietly, "may I have my phone call?" Kyle snorted. "Already itching to call a lawyer?" "No," Marcus replied evenly. "Just checking on the election results." That made them laugh even harder. "Election results?" Kyle repeated between chuckles. "You running for prom king?" Rick leaned against the bars. "Let me guess. You voted for that reform clown who thinks he's going to clean up the department." Marcus said nothing. The truth was, he hadn't just voted for the reform candidate. He was the reform candidate. For 6 months he had campaigned across Red Hollow County, knocking on doors, attending town halls, sitting with mothers who'd filed complaints that went nowhere, and fathers who'd watched their sons get thrown against squad cars for traffic stops that somehow turned into searches. He had debated Sheriff Douglas Whitmore on live television, calmly dismantling talking points about law and order and replacing them with discussions of accountability and constitutional policing. The race had been tight, closer than anyone expected, and the final ballots were being counted that very night. But the deputies processing him had no idea. They didn't recognize him without the suit, without the podium, without the campaign banner behind him. To them, he was just another black man with a phone and an attitude. "You know what your problem is?" Rick said, tapping the metal bar with his knuckle. "You don't understand how things work around here." Marcus finally stood, the chain between his cuffs clinking softly. "On the contrary," he said, voice calm but firm. "I understand exactly how things work around here." Kyle shook his head. "You're going to sit in that cell all night and think about that attitude." Marcus looked toward the small clock on the wall above the booking desk. 9:47 p.m. The polls had closed at 8. Certification usually came before midnight. He did the math in his head, slow and steady, like calculating odds. Rick noticed the glance. "You nervous?" he asked mockingly. "You should be. Obstruction carries weight." Marcus met his gaze. "So does misconduct." The room went quiet for half a second before Kyle scoffed. "Oh, I'm scared." He leaned in closer to the bars. "What are you gonna do? File a complaint?" Marcus held his stare. "Something like that." Rick turned away dismissively. "Book him. Toss him in holding." The cell door creaked open, and Marcus stepped inside without resistance, sitting back down on the bench as it clanged shut behind him. Kyle returned to his chair, still chuckling, while Rick filled out paperwork with lazy strokes of his pen. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, a summer storm rolling in over Red Hollow County. Neither deputy noticed the older woman who had just entered the lobby area, clutching a sealed envelope stamped with the official seal of the County Board of Elections. She approached the front desk quietly, clearing her throat as Kyle looked up, annoyance flickering across his face. "We're closed," he started to say, but she calmly placed the envelope on the counter. "I'm here to deliver certified results," she said. And in the holding cell, Marcus Reed closed his eyes briefly, not in fear, not in defeat, but in preparation, because the men who laughed the loudest never imagined they might be laughing at their next commanding officer. Upstairs, Sheriff Douglas Whitmore was alone in his office refreshing the county election website, muttering to himself that Red Hollow had never voted for a reform experiment. That experience always beat activism, that the numbers would correct themselves once the final precincts came in. But when the page finally reloaded with a bold banner reading final results, certified, the bourbon glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor as he stared at the screen. Douglas Whitmore, 49.2%. Marcus Reed, 50.8%. For a long moment he didn't breathe, because the man he had dismissed as a camera-waving agitator had just become the next sheriff of Red Hollow County. Downstairs, the booking desk phone rang sharply, cutting through Deputy Kyle Harmon's lingering laughter. "Red Hollow County Jail," he answered casually, but his posture stiffened as he listened. "Certified? Already." His eyes drifted slowly toward the holding cell. Rick Colson frowned. "What?" Kyle swallowed. "The sheriff's race. It's official." Rick smirked. "Yet? Whitmore pull it out." Kyle didn't answer. The silence stretched. Marcus Reed won. The words seemed unreal even as they left his mouth. Rick let out a quick, disbelieving laugh. "That's not funny." But the lobby door opened, and an older woman stepped forward holding a sealed envelope stamped with the County Board of Elections insignia. "Gentlemen," she said evenly, placing the document on the desk, "the results have been certified. Marcus Reed is the duly elected sheriff of Red Hollow County, effective at midnight." The room fell into a stillness so complete it hummed. Slowly, inside the cell, Marcus stood. Without his glasses, he still managed to look directly at them. "Deputy," he said calmly, extending his cuffed wrists slightly through the bars, "I believe you're restraining county property." Rick blinked. "What?" "The incoming sheriff," Marcus clarified. Kyle hurried to unlock the cuffs, keys rattling against the metal as they fumbled for the right one. The click of steel releasing skin sounded louder than it should have. Marcus rubbed his wrists once, then stepped forward as Kyle retrieved his glasses and phone with unsteady hands. When Marcus put the glasses back on, the shift was visible. His posture straightened, his focus sharpened, his presence filled the room in a way it hadn't before. He glanced briefly at his phone, dozens of missed calls, then slipped it into his pocket. "Deputy Colson," he said evenly, "you charged me with obstruction." Rick's mouth felt dry. "Yes." "Good," Marcus replied. "That establishes documentation." Kyle shifted nervously. "Documentation?" Marcus met his eyes. "There will be body camera footage." Rick stiffened, saying nothing. Marcus took a slow step closer to the desk. "Effective at midnight, I will initiate a departmental audit. Every excessive force complaint from the past 5 years. Every dismissed civilian report. Every missing recording." The confidence in his tone wasn't loud, but it was absolute. Rick tried to recover some authority. "You can't just walk in here and—" Marcus raised a hand slightly, not aggressive, simply decisive. "I can. I will." The earlier laughter felt like a mistake that couldn't be undone. "You laughed," Marcus continued quietly. "You assumed I was powerless." He looked from Kyle to Rick, holding each gaze long enough to make them uncomfortable. The badge doesn't create power. It transfers it. Upstairs, Whitmore was already on the phone with his attorney, voice tight and frantic. Downstairs, deputies who had once moved with careless confidence now stood uncertain, recalculating what the next 24 hours would mean. Marcus picked up the certification paper, glancing at the official seal, then set it back down deliberately. "Deputy Harmon," he said. "Yes, sir." The word slipped out before Kyle could stop it. Marcus noticed. "Prepare a full report of tonight's arrest. Include everything." Kyle nodded quickly. Marcus turned to Rick. "And preserve all footage immediately. Failure to do so will be treated as destruction of evidence." Rick's jaw tightened, but he gave a stiff nod. The woman from the election board gathered her folder and paused at the door. "Congratulations, Sheriff," she said. Marcus inclined his head politely. As the door closed behind her, the atmosphere in the jail shifted completely. Same walls, same desks, different balance. Marcus glanced once at the holding cell he had occupied less than an hour earlier, then back at the deputies who had mocked him. "Midnight comes fast," he said calmly. "I suggest you both use the time wisely." And this time, neither of them laughed. Midnight arrived without ceremony. No sirens or speeches to announce it. Just the quiet tick of the clock above the booking desk as one day ended and another began. And when the second hand slid past 12, Marcus Reed was no longer a detainee, a candidate, or a rumor. He was the sheriff of Red Hollow County. By morning, the courthouse steps filled with cameras and murmuring voices as deputies stood in pressed uniforms, their postures stiffer than usual, waiting for direction they weren't used to taking from someone like him. Marcus took the oath with his hands steady and his voice calm, promising to uphold the Constitution, not as a slogan but as a standard, and when applause rippled through the crowd, it carried something deeper than celebration. It carried relief. Inside the department, changes began quietly and immediately. Audit notices sent, body cam logs requested, internal affairs pulled into daylight. There were no public firings that day, no dramatic perp walks, just the unmistakable sense that the rules had changed, and everyone felt it. Rick Colson submitted his report late and incomplete. Kyle Harmon submitted his early and detailed. Both men avoided eye contact when Marcus passed through the bullpen, not out of fear of punishment, but because accountability is harder to face than anger. Marcus didn't gloat, didn't reference the cell, the cuffs, or the laughter. He didn't need to. Power, once transferred, speaks for itself. Later that afternoon, he stood alone in his new office, the same room Whitmore once occupied, sunlight cutting through the blinds as he set his glasses on the desk and exhaled slowly. The jail downstairs hummed with routine again, but it wasn't the same routine. It was quieter, more careful. The men who had laughed had learned a lesson they would never forget. Sometimes the person watching from the sidewalk, the one you dismiss, the one you lock behind bars, isn't powerless at all. Sometimes he's the future.